Hello and welcome to My PGCE, a podcast documenting my journey as a trainee teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James B. Before getting into this week's episode, I just want to clarify what I mean when I say that the podcast has a special focus on mental health. That doesn't mean that I'll be talking about mental health every episode. The podcast is first and foremost about my experience as a trainee teacher. So the majority of the content will be to do with teaching. But whenever a mental health issue arises, and they no doubt will arise quite often, I promise to talk about it. That's what I mean when I say a special focus on mental health. So, in the last episode, I spoke about why I want to become a teacher. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the application process, or at least my experience of the application process. But before I get into that, I need to talk about how I decided that the PGCE was the best route into teaching for me. There are lots of different ways to get into teaching. If you are yet to go to university, you could do an undergraduate teaching degree. If you've already had a long career doing something else, then you could go down the Now Teach route. So Now Teach offers a recruitment and support program for experienced professionals to retrain as teachers. And I believe Transition to Teach does something similar. But for me as a graduate, there seem to be three options. First, the PGCE. So the PGCE, or Postgraduate Certificate in Education, is a one-year teacher training course that's led by a university. So you'll spend some time in university learning about the theory of teaching, but the majority of the time you'll spend applying that theory in practice in a variety of schools. As a university student, you'll have access to all the usual facilities, resources and support that any university student would have access to. PGCEs are typically funded by a student loan or perhaps even a bursary or scholarship, which you wouldn't have to pay back. But whether you're eligible for one of those would depend on which subject you're training to teach. And it seems like the PGCE is the best recognised of all the different routes into teaching. The second option was the school direct route. So whereas the PGCE is led by a university, if you take the school direct route, then your training will be led by a school, and just one school. You'll spend less time learning about theory and more time in the classroom. So the school direct route seems to be a good option for people who already know where and in which school they would like to work. But since I don't yet know where I would like to work, I thought it would be better to get experience in a variety of schools as offered by the PGCE option. But there was one more alternative, and a controversial one. Teach First. Teach First is a charity that recruits graduates to teach in schools facing the biggest challenges. So these are schools where more than 50% of pupils are from low-income backgrounds. You're given 6 weeks of intensive training before spending 2 years at one of these schools. And you'll gain a postgraduate diploma in education and leadership, which is worth double the credits of a PGCE, all the while earning a full salary. So this may sound like a very attractive philanthropic option, but I had a couple of issues with it. The first two issues were fairly surface level. So to go down the Teach First route, you have to be willing to relocate to one of these challenging schools. And I'm not willing to relocate at the moment. I'll get into that a little bit more later. Second, Teach First offers a postgraduate diploma in education, as opposed to a postgraduate certificate in education. Now, the postgraduate diploma in education is worth twice the credits of a PGCE, but it doesn't seem to be as well recognised. I learnt that the Scottish equivalent of a PGCE is also called a PGDE, but it's different from the PGDE offered by Teach First, yet the two are easily confused. And this might be an issue because the Scottish PGDE isn't as universally accepted as the PGCE. But like I said, these are fairly surface level problems. I think there is in fact a much deeper problem with Teach First. Surely the most vulnerable, challenging students need teachers with lots of experience and who are going to stick around for a good while. Yet Teach First is matching them with graduates who have pretty much zero teaching experience aside from the 6-week training course, and many of whom leave after they've done their 2 years. Teach first, then do something else. I just don't see how that's a great way to support these students who are in quite desperate situations. The money spent on Teach First may be better spent incentivising more experienced teachers to move into the most challenging schools. Anyway, that might be a wholly misguided opinion of Teach First, but still it's what went through my head when I was thinking about which route into teaching I should take. So I ended up opting for the PGCE. You apply to do a PGCE through UCAS. Now there's no fixed deadline, but courses do fill up. So what I did, first of all, was decide where I wanted to do my PGCE, decided on my first choice anyway, contacted them to find out when the course usually fills up, and they told me that they usually stop taking applications in June, but that it could be earlier. So I had a rough deadline in mind, but resolved to get my application form submitted as soon as I possibly could. Now I seem to have skipped a step here because how did I decide where I wanted to do my PGCE? Now this is quite a complicated question for me. So I think the best advice I heard turned on the fact that your first job as a teacher is likely to be in one of the schools where you did your placements. So you should first decide whereabouts in the country you would like to work as a teacher and live, and then to apply for a PGCE program at a local university. I think that's great general advice, but it didn't quite apply to my specific situation. So first, I don't really know whereabouts in the country I would ultimately like to work as a teacher. I don't even really know how I'm supposed to make that sort of decision. Second, I currently enjoy quite privileged living arrangements, which I wouldn't be able to find elsewhere. I live on the university campus where I did my postgraduate studies as a resident tutor. So I live alongside students in halls of residence as part of the university's welfare system. Now it can be a job from hell if you find yourself surrounded on all sides by students who are party animals, but so far I've been very lucky and usually found myself among fairly quiet introverts. But even for the resident tutors who find themselves in the party blocks, the lack of sleep is usually outweighed by the fact that we don't have to pay any rent. So yes, like I said, I have a very privileged living arrangement. One I'm not willing to give up, not yet anyway. But it just so happens that the university where I work as a resident tutor has an excellent PGCE program. And I certainly wouldn't mind working as a teacher in the surrounding area. In fact, it's where I grew up. So for me, my first choice of university was obvious. It's the university where I'm currently living. But UCAS allows you to choose up to 3 programs. So while I was really only interested in doing the program at my current university, I decided to choose 2 more which could serve as practice runs for the interviews and assessments. And I must say I chose them almost entirely at random. Or at least the reasons for which I chose them were quite arbitrary. So I picked one because I'd been on holiday in the area once and thought it was nice. I picked the other because it's local to where my partner is currently studying at university. I think my final advice would be that the PGCE is a very tough course. At least that's what everyone says. So pick your programs in such a way that allows you to make everything else, so your living arrangements, travel arrangements, whatever it is, as easy as possible. There's no sense in adding any extra unnecessary strain to the situation. So I now had my 3 program choices, and I also had a deadline to work to. So it was time to steam ahead with the UCAS application form. The application form is fairly lengthy, but UCAS provide a very useful step-by-step guide on their website, which is easy enough to find. Those steps are as follows. You register to use Apply, you sign in to fill in the rest of your personal details and some additional information for UK applicants, you add your program choices, your education so far, your school and work experience, you write your personal statement, you get 2 references, you pay your fee and send your application, and finally you can track your progress and make changes if necessary. Now, the only part of the application that requires any real thought, and arguably the most important part of the application, is the personal statement. So what I like to do is get everything else done first, clear my mind, and then I can focus solely on the important bit, the personal statement. Now, in a personal statement, in any personal statement, you should aim to do 2 things. Well, you must do 2 things. First, you must explain why you want to do whatever it is you're applying to do. Second, you should explain why you're the person for the job, and this will involve detailing any relevant experience you have. So to use myself as an example, in the first part of my personal statement, I had to explain why I want to become a secondary maths teacher. And this can be broken down, or at least I broke it down, into 3 separate questions. Why do I want to become a teacher? Why do I want to become a maths teacher in particular? And why do I want to become a secondary maths teacher? So why do I want to teach maths to secondary school students? And to each of these questions, I devoted 1 paragraph. And I kept it pretty simple, using pretty plain language. So I started my first paragraph, I want to teach because. My second paragraph, I want to teach mathematics because. And my third paragraph, I want to teach 11 to 16-year-olds because. As for what comes after the because, I think that's likely to vary from applicant to applicant, and it's something you should sit down and think about really hard. Because this is where you first set the motivational fire within you that will need to burn throughout the application process, your PGCE, and on into your NQT year and beyond. So it has to be a hot fire. After I'd explained why I want to become a secondary maths teacher, I moved on to the second part of the personal statement, which is explaining why I think I'm the person for the job. So I detailed my past experience. And again, I split this up into 3 parts. First, I detailed my experience teaching, mainly mathematics, but I also mentioned philosophy. I then detailed my experience coordinating big groups of young people outside the classroom, so I've done some coaching in various sports clubs over the years. And then finally, I detailed my experience dealing with student welfare issues and educational inequalities. As for the writing process, in my first draft, all I worried about was getting all the information down. Then, once it was all down, I went back and polished it up. And after I'd done that, I sent it to my mum, I think, to proofread. And this is a crucial step, so you must always get someone to proofread your personal statement for grammatical errors and typos. If you've got no one else, I'm sure my mum would be happy to oblige. And then I slept on it and returned to it the following morning and made a few final tweaks before deciding that I was happy with what I had. But before submitting my application, there was one thing left to do: contact my referees. It's always a good idea to do this before you submit your application. First of all, it's just good manners to ask for a reference and also to warn them of an incoming reference request. And second, it's an opportunity to remind them who you are, to reintroduce yourself. The reason I save contacting my referees until last is so that I can send them a copy of my personal statement, which they can then refer to when writing their references. And once my referees had confirmed that they were happy to write me a reference, I checked through my application form one last time and then sent it off. What happened next? Well, within a few days, I received emails from my university choices confirming that they had received my application. And then I'd say within a week after that, I had received invitations to attend their interview and assessment days. And for at least 2 of the assessment days, I was allowed to pick a date. So I picked dates that would give me at least a week's worth of preparation time in between each assessment. And this was important because each assessment day was quite different, so I couldn't just prepare for them all in the same way. I had to tailor my approach to each. I also made sure that the assessment day for my first choice university came last, so that I could use the other 2 assessment days as practice. I say made sure, but in truth there was an element of luck involved here, so it just so happened to work out that I could choose my assessment days so that my first choice programme assessment came last, which was great. The first assessment day had 4 components. First, a literacy task. Second, a mini-teach presentation. Third, some maths questions. And finally, an individual interview. So I'll go through each of these in turn. For the literacy task, I was given an article beforehand about classroom behaviour management. And then, on the day, I was given half an hour to write an answer to the question, why is behaviour management important for learning? It was something like that. I can't remember the exact wording. But I remember being a little bit surprised by this question because the article we had been sent beforehand was about how to manage classroom behaviour effectively, and it listed various different methods. Yet the question we were now given was about why behaviour management is important, and that's quite a different topic. What I ended up doing was writing about the different ways in which learning becomes difficult, if not impossible, in a classroom where behaviour management is completely absent. So in maths, this would be called a proof by contradiction. You assume the opposite of what you're trying to prove, in this case that behaviour management is important, and then show that it leads to an absurdity. In this case, learning becoming very difficult. I should mention that this assessment day, in fact all of my assessment days, happened online, remotely, given that we were still in the grip of a pandemic at the time. So after the literacy task, we broke up into subject-specific groups, So me and the 2 other maths PGCE candidates joined one assessor, and as a group we did our mini-teach presentations. We had been sent some suggested topics beforehand, and I chose the topic of introducing algebra to Year 7 students. I did some research on Mathantics' YouTube channel and on BBC Bitesize before designing my own algebra worksheet. And on the worksheet, I tried to start with questions that would be familiar to Year 7 learners, so in particular questions just involving basic arithmetic. And then as the sets of questions progressed, I would build slowly towards the idea of an unknown variable, which is usually represented by x. So I was trying to start with knowledge that the students would already have, and gradually tweak and change the questions toward the desired learning outcome. And it seemed to go well. My presentation was about twice as detailed as one of the other candidates, and about half as detailed as the other candidates. And we had a good discussion afterwards. After the mini-teach presentation came 2 maths questions. So these were designed to test our subject knowledge. We weren't told what questions we'd get beforehand, and so there wasn't really any preparation you could do. It was also stressed that your performance on these questions wouldn't decide the fate of your PGCE application. I think they were just there to help the assessors decide whether to recommend a subject knowledge enhancement course or not. But thankfully, I managed to get both questions right, so that was the end of that. Now, the final part of the first assessment day was the individual interview. And again, we were told beforehand what to expect. In particular, we were told that we would be discussing the professional role of a teacher, what constitutes effective teaching and learning in your subject specialism, an inclusive learning environment, how you cope with demanding situations and feedback on performance, the demands and rewards of secondary teaching, and also current issues in secondary education. So those were the topics on the agenda. And in preparation, I did some research and wrote down my thoughts. Now, in the interview itself, we didn't cover all those topics, but we certainly stayed within them. So nothing came up that I hadn't been warned about beforehand. And again, the interview seemed to go just fine. So that was the end of the first assessment day. The second assessment day was, well, brief. It was just an interview. And I was told beforehand that the interview would be a series of questions designed to assess my suitability as a teacher and would explore my subject knowledge and knowledge of the national curriculum and education system, and would last approximately 15 minutes. Now, given that the other 2 assessment days were essentially a full day of assessments, including a half an hour to 45-minute interview, I thought that this was a typo. I thought that no way could they assess me in just a 15-minute interview. So I emailed them beforehand for clarification, and it was in fact correct. The entire assessment would consist of just a 15-minute interview. So I don't think I did any preparation for this assessment day in addition to what I'd already done for the first one. I think I may have had a quick look at the national curriculum, but that was it. And again, the interview went well. We didn't cover all the topics, but we certainly stayed within them. And at the end, I was asked if I had any questions for the interviewer. And I couldn't resist, so I asked the interviewer why their assessment was so short compared to other programs. And I really liked his answer. He said, "Because we're experts and we need no more than 15 minutes to decide whether you're right for the course." So that was the end of the second assessment day. 2 down, 1 to go. And the 1 to go was the one I really wanted to nail. So the first 2 had served as good practice, but now it was game day. The third and final assessment day had 2 components. First, a 5-minute mini lesson. Second, an interview. So again, I'll go through each of these in turn. I should perhaps also mention that this assessment day, along with the first one, started with a welcome talk where someone from the department would explain the ins and outs of their particular PGCE programme. I've skipped over it here because it wasn't part of the assessment. For the 5-minute mini lesson, I was allowed to choose between a topic I am passionate and knowledgeable about within my subject area or a current issue in education. I decided to go with the former. I prepared a lesson about counterexamples, which are very important in mathematics. Very briefly, a counterexample is an example that opposes or contradicts an idea or theory. So, for example, if you claimed that all students are lazy, I could provide a counterexample by pointing to a student who wasn't lazy, so a hardworking student. To aid my lesson, I was allowed to prepare just one PowerPoint slide. Under ordinary circumstances, I wouldn't have been allowed to use PowerPoint at all, which I think reflects the fact that teachers are generally discouraged from using PowerPoint. But since we were having to deliver our lessons remotely, I was allowed to use just one slide. So I had to use the space on that slide very carefully. And I tried to make my lesson interactive, so I worked in several questions that I would ask my audience in order to, force their engagement. And my audience on this occasion was one of the assessors. And that's it. The questions I asked ended up provoking more discussion than I had anticipated, and so I ended up running over the 5 minutes just a little bit. But that didn't seem to be too much of a problem. So on the whole, it seemed to go well. Now, after the mini lesson came the interview, for which I had to do 3 things in advance. First, I had to read and understand the main message of an article extract. So the article was about why teachers enter and stay in teaching, and it listed various reasons. But the main message seemed to be that teachers enter and stay in teaching because 1, they enjoy teaching and their subject, 2, they think teaching is socially meaningful, and 3, they think they are good at their jobs. I thought that last one was very interesting, in that what matters is not whether teachers are in fact good at their jobs, but just whether they think they are. That's what's important for teacher retention. According to the article, at least. So that was the first thing I had to do in preparation for the interview. The second was to familiarise myself with the Department for Education's teachers' standards. And the third was to familiarise myself with the university's character values, which were organised into intellectual, moral, civic, and performance values. And the interview itself, again, seemed to go well. The assessor asked me about one of the secondary reasons why teachers enter and stay in the profession, which I think fell outside the main message of the article extract. But fortunately, I had my notes to hand, and I'd read the article several times anyway, so we still managed to have a good conversation about that. As for the character values, I was asked to identify, I think, 4 that I believed were strengths of mine, and then also 4 that I believed may be weaknesses. And we had a good chat about that too. And that was it. All 3 assessment days done. At the end of each one, I was given an informal indication that I had done well enough to be accepted onto the programme. And to be honest, I generally got the impression that everyone who had got as far as the assessment day had already been reserved a place, and the assessment day was just about ensuring that you weren't a lunatic. And within a few days, I received email confirmations that my places on the programmes had indeed been secured. So all that was left for me to do was to log back into UCAS and to choose the one I wanted. I think I have 2 pieces of general advice for those preparing for PGCE assessments and interviews. First, in my experience, the universities tell you exactly what you need to prepare, and then the assessments and interviews always fell squarely within that preparation. I was never thrown a curveball. So basically, just do what the universities tell you to do, and you can't really go wrong. My second piece of advice concerns the mini lesson that you'll no doubt be asked to deliver. You should already be passionate about your subject, but pick a topic within your subject that you are especially interested in. That way, when you deliver your lesson, your enthusiasm for your subject and for teaching should come naturally and be blindingly obvious to the assessors. The PGCE programme wasn't the only thing I applied for. I also applied for a mathematics teacher training scholarship, which is essentially an extra incentive to train to become a maths teacher, given that maths teachers are currently in short supply. The scholarship offers a £26,000 tax-free bursary and additional support such as membership of professional bodies, training courses, and access to additional resources. Now, much like the PGCE programmes, the application process for the scholarship consisted of first an application form, and then, if your application form is successful, an interview. For the application form, I used much of what I had already written on my PGCE application form, but the personal statement was different in a few important ways. The application form says that my personal statement must include, first, why I want to become a maths teacher, second, why I believe I will be an inspirational maths teacher, third, why I wish to become a maths scholar, and fourth, why I believe being a maths scholar will support my future career aims, and that failure to address all these points will lead to my application being rejected, so it's important to address each of these points explicitly. And to do that, I would recommend using the same language that they use on the application form. The first point was, why do I want to become a maths teacher? And I'd already discussed that on my PGCE personal statement, so I could tick that one off straight away. The second, why do I believe I will be an inspirational maths teacher? So in my PGCE personal statement, I spoke about maths anxiety, and I said in particular that I refuse to believe that anyone is inherently bad at maths. So for my scholarship personal statement, I simply added to the start of that sentence, I believe I will be an inspirational maths teacher because I refuse to believe that anyone is inherently bad at maths. So that ticked that box too. As for the final 2 points, I addressed them in an additional paragraph at the end. And again, I used the same language that was on the application form. So I said, I wish to be a maths scholar because I want to learn more about teaching mathematics, and I would take full advantage of all available resources. I believe that being a maths scholar will support my future career aims because it will show employers that I am serious about teaching and situate me within a network of similarly ambitious people. So that was the personal statement and application form completed. I sent it all off, received a confirmation of submission, and then I think within a week I was invited to the assessment day. And I can't remember whether this was a matter of luck or whether I was able to choose the date, but it ended up being 1 week after my final PGCE assessment day, which was very convenient. The scholarship assessment had 3 components. First, answering a question of the form, "But why do I need to learn about X? I'll never use it." Second, an extended discussion. And third, an interview. I'll go through each in turn. For the first component, I was given the topic of enlargements. So an enlargement is a transformation that changes the size of a shape. Okay? And I had to prepare a 3-minute answer to the question, "But why do I need to learn about enlargements? I'll never use it." Which is perhaps the sort of question you may encounter in the classroom. I prepared my answer first by looking up enlargements on BBC Bitesize because it's been a long time since I did my GCSE and I couldn't remember what they were. But I quickly learned that enlargements have another name, uniform scaling, and that allowed me to connect it with some of the things I'd learnt about at university. So I refreshed my memory and then looked up enlargements or uniform scaling on Wikipedia. And then I thought about all the things you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have an understanding of enlargements. So that's the way I plan to tackle this question. I argued that if you didn't understand enlargements, that would rule out certain activities, which in turn would rule out certain careers. But I also spoke more generally about how learning about enlargements, as with every other new topic in mathematics, exposes us to a new set of problems, which gives us the opportunity to get better at solving new problems, a skill which is essential not only to every career, but also to everyday life. So I tried to give a more general answer too, just in case these hypothetical students weren't interested in becoming photographers or web designers or engineers or architects. The second component of the scholarship assessment day was the extended discussion. So for this, I was asked the question, how, as a mathematics NQT, newly qualified teacher, I could share this topic, enlargements, across departments to improve cross-curricular links. Where are the obvious links and what stumbling blocks do you envisage? I was asked to prepare a 90-second introduction to this discussion. Now, in my previous answer, I had already discussed how having an understanding of enlargements was important for various careers. So, for the first part of this question, concerning cross-curricular links, I simply looked at how those careers aligned with different GCSE subjects. But then I spoke about how I would only attempt to draw a cross-curricular link if I thought it would truly embed learning. This was a tip from my teacher training advisor. So, a brief side note here. If you register your interest in becoming a teacher on the Get Into Teaching website, you can get free one-to-one advice from a teacher training advisor. And it's well worth doing. My advisor sent me lots of useful information. And then, once I had her email address, I sent her a couple of specific questions to do with my applications. And one was about how to effectively draw cross-curricular links. And she told me that cross-curricular links are only worthwhile when they truly embed learning. So that's what I tried to keep in mind when answering this question. The third and final component of the scholarship assessment day was the interview, for which I had to prepare answers to 4 questions. First, inspirational teachers have a wide skill set. Can you tell us about a time when you had to think outside the box to complete a task? And I spoke about the time I had to teach myself web design, which certainly fell outside of my box. The second question: how do you think the scholarship will help you develop the skills and confidence to be at the forefront of mathematics education? For this question, I simply echoed some of the information on their own website. The third question: please give us an example of when you had to do something tiresome. How did you motivate yourself in such a situation? What did you learn from this which you could apply to teaching? Here I spoke about my work in the library and how I spent a lot of time shelving books, which is a monotonous and endless task and requires a certain mindset in order to not go insane. I spoke about how this mindset would be useful when it comes to some of the more tiresome aspects of teaching, for example, piles of marking. The fourth and final question: why is it important to introduce your pupils to the diversity of people involved in mathematics, and how do you think this could be achieved? Please name mathematicians, including at least one living mathematician, who you think can help you answer this question. For this question, I did my usual trick. I thought about what would happen if students weren't introduced to the diversity of people within mathematics. And I explained how this would be bad, not only for the students themselves, but also for mathematics as a discipline. As for specific mathematicians, I did some research and ended up going with Gladys West, a black mathematician whose accomplishments laid the groundwork for the invention of GPS, and Mariam Mirzakhani, who was the first woman and the first Iranian to be awarded the Fields Medal, which is like the Nobel Prize of mathematics, except even better because it's only awarded every 4 years. It's like the Nobel Prize and the Olympics of mathematics. And it also happened to be Mariam's birthday on the day of my assessment, which I thought was quite an auspicious sign. And the assessment did indeed go well. It was me and 2 assessors, and they asked the questions pretty much word for word. So again, my advice would be to prepare exactly what they tell you to prepare. I also saw on Twitter a few days before my assessment that applications for the scholarship had closed, yet they still had lots of assessments to carry out. And this was encouraging, or it at least took some of the pressure off, because I once again knew that a scholarship was already reserved for me based solely on my application form, and all I had to do on the assessment day was not come across a raving lunatic, which I just about managed to do. At the end of the assessment, again, I received an informal indication that I had done well enough. And then within a week or so, I received an official email confirmation that I had indeed secured a scholarship, which has really boosted my confidence heading into the PGCE. And that is where I would say my experience of the application process came to an end. This has very much been a cursory overview, but if you would like to know about anything in any more detail, then don't hesitate to get in touch. Since finishing my applications, I have been doing some preparation for my PGCE, and that will be the topic of the next episode, which I hope to publish before the end of August, so keep an eye out. If you liked this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at mypgcepod or email mypgcepod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/mypgcepod and helping fund both the podcast and my PGCE course. Thank you, and talk again soon.